Welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast, the podcast that explores the issues, stories, and people that have shaped places into what they are today. Here's your host, Adam Kamek.
If you're interested in starting a new website, then get your domain name and web hosting through Bluehost. Bluehost is easy to use, has great customer support, and easily integrates with WordPress, Google Workspace, and numerous other online tools. Plus, if you get your hosting at my link, then you could potentially get your site promoted via this podcast. Get your hosting through Bluehost at placesandprofiles.com/blue. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast. Today I'm speaking with John Dinges about Salvador Allende, Augusto Pinochet, Operation Condor, and key events from that period in Chilean and South American history. John held the position of Godfrey Lowell Cabot Professor of International Journalism at Columbia University from 1996 to 2016, and he currently holds that position with emeritus status. He previously worked on the foreign desk of the Washington Post, in which capacity he traveled as a reporter to cover civil wars in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. He is the author of The Condor Years, How Pinochet and His Allies Brought Terrorism to Three Continents, and Death and the Revolution. You can follow John's work at johndinges.com, that's JOHNDINGES.com, and thecondoryears.com. You can follow him on Twitter at jdinges. For more information, please check out the show notes page for today's episode at placesandprofiles.com/14. John, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks. It's good to be with you.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. So I mentioned in the introduction that we're going to be talking about Operation Condor, and your book is The Condor Years. You have a website, The Condor Years. So let's start there. For people who have not heard this term before, what exactly was Operation Condor, and what time period are we looking at?
Operation Condor was an alliance of 6 military governments in the 1970s. It is the phenomenon that grows out of the Cold War. Essentially, it's an attempt to internationalize the anti-communist struggle that was being promoted by the United States. Operation Condor was not actually created by the United States, but the dictatorships that we had helped put in place, that we encouraged as part of our war against our Cold War against the Soviet Union, those governments set up an alliance that allowed them to operate inside each other's countries to track down the dissidents who might be in another country as exiles or working as political activists in another country. So Operation Condor was secret. It was illegal. It internationalized the repression, so we called it transnational repression. There were secret prisons. According to my data, about 654 people were victims of Operation Condor, of which almost 400 were killed.
And we'll return to some of the things that you talked about here momentarily, but give us a little personal background on your part. How did you become interested in Operation Condor? I know that you have connections to Chile, which was in many ways at the heart of Operation Condor, but how did you become interested in it? Why did you decide to write about it?
I lived in Chile from 1972 to 1978. I was sent there by the Inter-American Press Association as a scholarship recipient, which basically gave me a stipend to live there. Which was very easy because the currency was very weak. And I stayed on after the fellowship was over for another 5 years as a freelance writer, basically. I also taught English for a year and a half. So I was there during the military coup of 1973, in which the military overthrew Salvador Allende. I had gone to Chile because of my interest in the revolution. My interest, me and thousands of other Europeans and Americans who were interested in a revolution that would solve the problems of poverty and inequality, but do them by preserving democracy. So it was a great advance over the socialist experiments of the certainly of the Russian Revolution and the Eastern Bloc, because its adherence to democracy was total. It was a great place to be. My journalism, I started as a stringer for the Washington Post and Time Magazine, and that's what I was doing in 1975 to 1978. And during that time, the Pinochet government assassinated a Chilean exile leader named Orlando Letelier in Washington, D.C. In 1976. So imagine an ally of the United States, a right-wing dictatorship that is an ally of the United States in the context of the Cold War. This is during the Nixon-Ford administration. Commits an act of terrorism on Massachusetts Avenue in Washington, D.C. That was a tremendous story. It actually was the first act of international terrorism committed in the United States. Of course, 2001 blew away that uniqueness when terrorism was much more terrible in the United States. But in 1976, this attracted a lot of attention. Orlando Letelier had been foreign minister of Chile, and he had been ambassador to the United States. So in Washington, the people in power knew him, including Henry Kissinger. He'd had lunch with Henry Kissinger just a couple months before he was killed. I began to write about that, to investigate that. I was convinced that Chile was behind the assassination, but of course the proof had not yet been produced. The FBI was investigating it. And I ultimately wrote a book about the assassination called Assassination on Embassy Row. It was my first book, written with Saul Landau, who was a colleague of Orlando Letelier. They worked together in the Institute for Policy Studies, which was a policy think tank in Washington, D.C. So that was what got me into book writing. And my interest has continued in Chile. Chile, I consider my second country. My family is very Chilean. My wife is Chilean. My oldest son lives in Chile to this day, and so I've continued to write about the Southern Cone and Chile during these past 50 years. The 50th anniversary of the coup was just last month.
Now, going back to your first answer, you mentioned that Operation Condor was secret and illegal. So I do want to return to the Chilean coup here in a moment, but can you talk a little more about what you mean when you say that Operation Condor was secret and illegal?
The ability of police forces to cross borders and pursue criminals is enshrined in international law. And there's an institution of international cooperation called Interpol, and that's legal. When a judge gives authorization for an extradition request to another country, that is processed through Interpol, and there's a request to arrest that person in the other country, in the country where that person has fled. And if they catch him, they extradite him back to the country that had asked for their arrest. That's the legal way you handle a criminal. Condor was explicitly designed to be what one of its organizers called Interpol for the subversion. In other words, this is their Interpol that will go after the dissidents, what they call the subversives, the political people who are leading the opposition to the military governments. It's illegal, of course, because there's no judges giving arrest warrants, there's no extradition. It is simply one country's security forces asks another country that for the arrest of a certain person, they had a central database of information on thousands of dissidents and exiles all around Latin America, including people who were already in Europe, and of course, Orlando Letelier, who was in Washington, D.C., and other people who were in the United States. They would then transmit this information from one country to another through telex, which was the internet of the 1970s. And they would go after the person. They would if they captured the person, they would put the person in a secret prison. If they didn't assassinate them outright, they would interrogate them in secret prisons. In almost all cases, the person would ultimately be executed secretly, and then their body would be disposed of secretly so that you were not able to find them. In more than 100 cases, the person who was arrested in one country was then transported to the country that had asked for his or her arrest. So they called this, and we came up with the word rendition when the United States was doing this during the aftermath of the terrorist attacks in New York in 2001. It is an illegal action under international law to take a prisoner from one country to another country without a court order. And of course, in this case, there was absolutely no legal scrutiny of what they were doing, and Operation Condor was set up to eliminate these people, to interrogate them, get the information that they could from them using torture, and then to kill them. In almost all cases, and certainly the most important cases, all of the people who were arrested and transported from one country to another were killed.
Now, you've mentioned a few times that secret prisons were involved in Operation Condor. How extensive were the secret prisons? How many people were held in them? What light can you shed on the secret prisons?
There was a prison in Chile that was used for called Villa Grimaldi. I was actually taken there at one point in 1975 as a prisoner, but I was only held for one day. It was mistaken identity. I'm not making myself at all a victim, but I was taken there together with my girlfriend, who is now my wife, and two other people. That was a secret prison that has become very well known in Chile. There was another prison in Chile on the street called Simón Bolívar, a very well-known street in Santiago. That prison was secret until 2007. So with all of our investigations during all of these years, we still failed to discover the existence of this secret prison. They're not like prisons. I mean, they don't like have bars and things like that. They're the one in Simón Bolívar was a parcela, a large lot that at one time actually had plants and a little bit of cultivation. It's on the outskirts of Santiago. The other one, Villa Grimaldi, was an old nightclub. So it's on a big estate, probably half an acre or something like that, and a very nice building, which had been used as a nightclub at one point. It probably built originally as a mansion for some rich family. In Argentina, the secret prison that was used for Operation Condor was called Automotores Orletti. In other words, it's a car repair shop called Orletti. Actually, the real name was Cerruti, but for a process of misidentification, it became known as Orletti. So a car repair shop in the middle of Buenos Aires had 2 floors, and on the bottom floor, the prisoners that survived, very few prisoners survived, but a few did, said that there was still grease on the floor, and the mechanical devices used to raise cars so they could have their oil change and have and do repairs. And then upstairs there were a series of rooms, and that's where the prisoners were held, and then there were torture rooms where they were tortured with a variety of techniques, many of which they'd learned from Brazil. Those are the most important secret prisons used for Operation Condor. These same prisons and other prisons were used for prisoners of the country in which they're located. Argentina had a vast system of secret prisons. In some sense, they weren't so secret because people know that they were military installations that were being used to gather together the hundreds of prisoners that they were rounding up. But of course, nobody had access to them. They were completely immune to any kind of judicial review or anything like that. So they were places of great fear and terror that people may have known that there were prisoners in those places, and nobody knew what was happening to those prisoners. It was a time in which terror had been institutionalized as a state system. And the Operation Condor is probably one of the most sinister aspects of the general repression of that era, the mass repression of the era. And it was the most selective. It was the one that was directed not only at the citizens of your own country, but at the citizens of some other country that happened to be there and had some kind of political connections. It was a terrible era.
Now, you've mentioned a few times the use of torture, and torture is a topic that here in the U.S. is at least on the minds of many Americans, given the role of torture in the aftermath of 9/11 and its association with Guantanamo Bay, but also its association with CIA black sites and other places around the world where torture has been carried out. How did torture in these secret prisons and torture in Latin America during the Operation Condor period, how does that type of torture compare with some of the forms of torture that we might associate with the word torture over the last couple of decades since 9/11?
Torture is a specific term. It is not the same as brutality. It is not the same of being, put in a cell with rats or, vermin or something like that. Those are bad conditions, and those are violations of human rights, but they're not the same as torture. Torture is the specific and intentional infliction of pain on a person under your custody, under your control, that's intended either to elicit information from them or to punish them for something. And the torture techniques are there's a wide variety of torture techniques. Of course, we may have learned about it in medieval history with things like the rack and things like that used by the Catholic Church. But in the 1970s, and then fast forward to the 2000 era, the torture techniques were used in Latin America were I won't go into the details of the torture techniques unless you want me to do that, because it's pretty grim. But suffice it to say that they were very similar to torture techniques that had been used in Brazil, and to a certain extent, they were similar to techniques used by France in Algeria, in the war in Algeria. And French advisors had been in Argentina and in Brazil, and have acknowledged that they were training them in torture techniques. The torture techniques that the United States uses had the same purpose, to elicit information and for reprisal against your enemy, the intentional infliction of severe pain. They were different, however. The techniques were different. I mean, exposing somebody in the cold, hanging. They're similar in some ways to the techniques used in Latin America, but you can tell that there's a different style to them. Waterboarding, for example, which became famous in the 9/11 era. Waterboarding is a name for a technique that was very much used in Latin America. Only the way that was done in Latin America was with a barrel in which they would immerse the person upside down until they, in many cases, they did actually drown. But the idea was to take them in and take them out so that they thought they were drowning. The waterboarding used by the United States was people were put on a plank and with a towel over their head, and then water was poured over the towel, so it was impossible to breathe. And that would continue long enough so that you became desperate and thought you were drowning and would break. So it's a different style of the same idea. Suspension was used in different ways there. Suspension was used by the 9/11 torturers, but somewhat different styles. I bring that up because the comparison of the styles, because it's often said that the United States trained the Latin Americans in torture techniques. I have examined that pretty carefully, and I don't think that that's true. The United States in the 1970s was training thousands of soldiers, mainly officers, at the School of the Americas in the Panama Canal Zone. And indeed, there were torture techniques being taught there. They were the American-style torture techniques. And so it's no question that the United States was counseling, advising these right-wing military that torture was something that you could use, and that was applied in their own countries. But they seem to favor the techniques that they learned from the Brazilians and the French more than what they learned from the United States.
All right, now let's go back to Chile, which we've obviously talked about a handful of times here already. But earlier you brought up the coup, and it seems like the 1973 Chilean coup is central to understanding Operation Condor in a lot of ways. So for people who are unaware of what happened in the coup in 1973 in Chile, can you talk about what that coup was, and can you explain how that fits into the larger context of Operation Condor?
Sure. What has to be the context of all of this is the Cold War, in which the United States is very deeply involved in fighting either covertly or overtly against leftist movements in Latin America. And of course, in going back decades before, the United States was involved in overthrowing a democratic government in Guatemala. That was in the 1940s. And there were governments, Dominican Republic, Nicaragua. I mean, over the years, the United States has been involved in overthrowing governments, some of which were not particularly admirable governments. Some of them were undoubtedly, there were some dictatorships, for example, in Dominican Republic, to Trujillo, and some were admirable democratic experiments, but were left wing, and so the United States, at the behest of large companies, United Fruit, in the case of Guatemala, overthrew these governments because they were organizing the workers. So in the 1970s, it's a different context. The Cold War is much more intense. The United States is focused on controlling the events in Latin America and preventing the communists, the Soviet Union, and particularly Cuba, which had a successful revolution in 1959 and was admired by leftist movements all around Latin America as a successful revolution. And it has to be said, a very undemocratic revolution. And so the United States policy was to prevent this from happening in Latin America. Salvador Allende was a well-known, admired politician. He was the president of the Chilean Senate. He had run for president 3 times, and he was elected in 1973. The United States was, his program was socialist, but he advocated agrarian reform. He advocated a mixed economy in which you would have state-controlled industries, state-owned industries, together with capitalist private industry, and it was a unique and unprecedented program of radical change, but it preserved democracy, parliamentary processes, free elections, free press. I was there, and it was the freest, most rollicking political environment I'd ever been in during the Allende government. In 1973, the experiment was going south. It was not. The economy was failing. Inflation was 900%. There were tremendous problems with the economic experiment. The industries were not productive, et cetera, et cetera. It was not going in a good direction. Part of that was because the United States was undermining the economy by preventing international loans and things like that. Part of it was that there was an opposition, the very strong opposition inside Chile that was also partly financed by the CIA. But I don't want to say that it was the United States that did everything. The Allende government never successfully garnered a strong majority behind its program, and much of the opposition to him was effective, and it was within the democratic system. There was terrorism as well against him, but the upshot is that in September 1973, it was a very weakened government. We were all expecting at some point there's going to be some kind of a military move. We thought that, and other journalists, there will be a Latin American coup, a Latin American military takeover, in which they will remove one government and call elections a year from now, and then another government will take over. That's the pattern that you had in many countries when you had military takeovers. In this case, the military coup led by General Augusto Pinochet was a modern authoritarian experiment that has been imitated in other countries since then, and it's based on the idea of the physical eradication, in other words, killing of your opponents, and extreme repression, so that ideas, the leftist ideas that were so popular, would be put down, and most importantly, that the uppity poor people and campesinos and peasants and workers who thought that they were going to have some power, that they would never again think that they could take power, and that the aristocracy, the business people, would remain calling the shots in the country. And so the repression was brutal against peasant groups, against the organized workers who controlled many of the factories in the outskirts of Santiago. And of course, the military move decapitated the government, replaced everybody in all the ministries, kicked out most of the workers, anybody that was politically connected, and in the process, the president Salvador Allende commits suicide because he refused to turn himself over to the military to be humiliated. So that was the coup of 1973. Well, overall, and I've written a lot about that. My latest book is about 2 Americans who were killed in those early days, among the hundreds and hundreds of other workers, intellectuals, peasants who were killed, and thousands of people who were rounded up and put in prisons. They turned the national soccer stadium in Santiago, into a mass prison, and 7,000 people were kept there in the first few weeks.
Now, you mentioned that the CIA, they weren't directly pulling the strings or anything like that in the coup, but there was a little bit of CIA involvement. What exactly did the CIA's involvement in Operation Condor in general, but both in Chile and in general across the southern cone of South America, look like during this time period?
So your formulation is correct. I wouldn't call it a little bit of involvement, right? The CIA had liaison and relationships. I call them in my book intimate relationships with the security forces and the top generals. And it's not only the CIA; it was the Pentagon. We had military advisors in all of these countries. During Allende, we had a military attaché. We had specific liaison positions. We had what they called the MIL group, the military group, which was liaisons with each of the branches of the armed forces. So we had a Navy person, we had an Army person, we had an Air Force person, and then there were police liaisons, but that was a different story. So the CIA and the U.S. military had very close relationships with the military of the countries in all of these countries during the period when they overthrow their governments and install dictatorships. We then continued those liaison relationships together with military aid and military training. So we're providing equipment, we're providing training, and when we're providing financial aid, which has increased after the military takeovers. So, for example, in the case of Allende, a military aid, financial aid, economic aid, had been minimized, had been greatly reduced. In other words, no new programs were approved, and military aid was kind of stagnant because the Allende government would not request any additional military aid. After the coup, military aid goes up considerably. So at the time of the actual coup, the military didn't need our immediate involvement in the coup. The United States was encouraging military coup as a solution to getting rid of the Allende experiment. That was our official policy. But what we were doing to accomplish that was indirect. It was not directly financing or participating in the organization. And we were not even directly informed of the plans in any detail. And the best example of that is a document that was just declassified only a few weeks ago. It was the report on President Nixon's desk on September 11th, 1973, the day of the coup. So at 7:30 in the morning on the day of the coup, time zones are pretty much the same between Chile and the United States. Nixon is told that the coup seems to be underway It is being led by the Navy in Valparaiso, which has taken over the city. Some units of the Army are taking part in the coup in Santiago and elsewhere in the country, but Allende still has cards to play to keep the military on his side in some parts of the military. The CIA, which wrote this intelligence report for Nixon, did not know on the day of the coup that the leader was General Pinochet. That General Pinochet, who was the head of the army under Allende, the CIA did not yet know that he had gone over to become part of the coup. And his participation, of course, meant that the whole army now was participating in the coup. So our information was somewhat spotty, even on the day of the coup. That did not diminish our support of it or our enthusiasm for it, but it pretty much establishes that we weren't part of the planning.
If you're interested in starting a website, then use Bluehost. I use Bluehost for placesandprofiles.com, and it's great. Their customer support is quick, responsive, and helpful, and it works well with WordPress, WooCommerce, Google Workspace, and countless other online tools. As an added bonus, if you get your domain name or hosting through my Bluehost link, then I will mention your website on the show and link to your website on placesandprofiles.com, as long as your website is not inappropriate and is not significantly opposed to my beliefs and values. Check out Bluehost and get your domain name and hosting today by going to placesandprofiles.com/blue. Again, that's placesandprofiles.com/blue. Well, and you mentioned that American involvement wasn't just limited to the CIA, but that the Pentagon was also involved. What was the Pentagon's involvement in Operation Condor, and what involvement did Henry Kissinger have in Operation Condor?
So those are two pretty separate things. The military involvement in Operation Condor specifically was the liaison relationships in each of the countries. So you have intelligent Operation Condor is primarily an operational intelligence entity. It's an alliance, but it's an alliance of security forces. So it's a military alliance, but it's very specific to the intelligence apparatus in each country and the security forces that were involved in the repression, right? Tracking down the internal dissidents. The U.S. military, one of my sources in writing my book was a colonel named Gracie. Actually, he lives in Texas now. I'm not sure if he's still alive, but he was the liaison to military intelligence in Argentina, to Army intelligence in Argentina. And he was very familiar with the methods that they were using. And he, in his conversations with me, said that he was trying to inculcate in them better intelligence methods, the use of secret sources, the use of infiltration, instead of relying on torture and killing and disappearances. And I believe him. I think that was the message we were delivering to them. But it shows that we were very intimately involved and knew what they were doing. The CIA was specifically carrying on liaison with whatever intelligence operations were going on in the country. If it was military intelligence, that was what we were involved in. But many of these countries also had state intelligence apparatus similar to the CIA. The CIA, of course, is a civilian organization that gathers information of its own, but it also supposedly coordinates intelligence from military intelligence services. In the United States, it's DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency. Similar organizations existed in some of the Latin American countries. So the CIA had connections up and down the entire state system, not just with the military. And the CIA was operational in the sense that they were conducting operations that were designed to influence the course of events in these countries. So Operation Condor, the CIA knew about Operation Condor, but they weren't involved in organizing it. They found out about it like 3 months after it had actually started operating. In March 1976, Argentina falls into the camp of the dictatorships when its government is overthrown by the military. It was probably the bloodiest of all the military governments. Around that time, Operation Condor, which had already been approved by the military in Argentina in the alliance with Chile, Uruguay, Bolivia, and Paraguay. Bolivia and then Brazil joined shortly after. This goes into full force in Argentina because many of the exiles from Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, and Brazil had gathered in Argentina because Argentina still was a civilian government in early 1976. So when the other governments were falling into dictatorships, their exiles, first they went to Chile, and then Chile is overthrown by the military, and the exiles all go into Argentina and are gathered in Argentina. So Argentina is the most brutal of these dictatorships, and they conduct the Operation Condor is focused on operations in Argentina following March 1976, and at that time the CIA learns about it in detail and clearly has briefings from members of the security forces. The level of information that the CIA had about Operation Condor includes the names of targets, people that they're going to go after, in some cases even before those people are arrested, that are captured. And the CIA also discovers, after a meeting in Santiago, it was the second organizational meeting of Operation Condor. It occurred in June 1976. They learned that the CIA, they learned that Operation Condor was planning assassinations in Europe. And they were concerned about that because that's basically planning terrorist activity in a NATO country. What they didn't know was that Chile was using Operation Condor around this same time, July and August of 1976, to launch an operation to the United States, which ended in the assassination of Orlando Letelier in a car bombing on Massachusetts Avenue in Washington, D.C.
Now, we've talked about Chile. You mentioned Argentina there a little bit in your last response. Can you give some specifics and some details on what Operation Condor looked like in other South American countries? We had this extending into Paraguay, Bolivia, Brazil, Uruguay. What was going on in some of these other countries?
So all of these countries were dictatorships. For example, Paraguay had been a dictatorship since the late 1950s. Bolivia had gone through many governments, some of them civilian, some of them military. Bolivia had actually had a military president who was a left-winger named Santos. Brazil had been a dictatorship since 1964 when the military had come in. These countries joined together in order to control their political opposition who were outside the country. For example, the very important and very well-known leftist movement in Uruguay was called Tupamaros. They were known as the Romantic Revolutionaries. They were kind of Marxist, but not very serious Marxists. But they were a very large urban guerrilla operation, very successful for a while. They would rob a bank and then they would go to the poor people's area and distribute money, for example. So they were very popular. Well, they were defeated in 1972, and they fled into other Latin American countries, and the military took over in 1973 completely. So all of these countries are under military control. They have their own security forces internally. Their concern is that their opposition is outside their own country. So Operation Condor was designed to go after those people. Well, since most of them were in Argentina, Operation Condor sets up a general command, a central command operation in Argentina, and each of the countries that are members of Operation Condor posted military commanders in Argentina that were part of this central command. And they would then coordinate operations to go after the dissidents from their own country. The Chileans were among the most important operations, but Uruguay was actually the country that had the most. Uruguay is right next to Argentina, of course, right across a river. And more Uruguayans were killed in Argentina than were killed in Uruguay itself. That's how serious Operation Condor was. So each of the countries, the security forces were in each of the countries. There was this central command in Argentina, and then they would decide on targets collectively in an operation called Theseus, or in Spanish, Teseo, which is named for the mythical character in Greek mythology, Theseus. And Operation Theseus, or Teseo, was designed to gather together operations involving people soldiers, officers from various countries, usually Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay, and they would then travel as a unit to carry out an assassination in another country, either Mexico or in or Europe, or in the case of Letelier in the United States. So the organization of this alliance, the organization of their operations, is what I explore in my book and describe in great detail.
All right, so just a few more questions for you, and then we'll wrap up for today. But I want to go back to Argentina because we've talked about Argentina several times throughout this conversation. And of course, immediately prior to the 1976 coup, the Peron family was still in power, or had come back into power in Argentina. So how did Peronism and the legacy of the Perons factor into the onset of Operation Condor and Operation Condor coming to be?
So General Peron was a very popular, and he's called a populist leader, who took power in the 1950s and was a dictator, but not a brutal dictator. He created a workers' movement, and his followers were called the shirtless ones, descamisados. His wife, Isabel, I'm sorry, Eva Peron, was so popular that eventually she died. But a New York musical was created for the character of Eva. So Argentine politics is basically, since the late 1940s, Peronism and everybody else. Peronism is still the governments that were in Argentina until, until recently, were part of what they call the Justicialista movement, which is the Peronist movement in its modern shape. Peron was overthrown in a coup in the 1950s, went to Spain, and from exile kept in touch with the movement that he had started in Argentina. In 1974, he returns to Argentina in a triumphal return. Thousands and thousands of people turn out to greet him. And of course, at this point, the Peronist movement had actually divided between a left-wing part of it called Montoneros and a right-wing fascist, really, truly fascist in the style of Mussolini wing. Those two wings of Peronism had fought battles as he returned, and they were competing to be who would actually be the tendency that Peron would support in his new government. He was quite old at this point and infirm, and he died within a year. And they turned power over to his new wife, whose name was Isabel, and she was kind of the opposite of Eva. She was everything but charismatic. She was also incompetent, and her government was a disaster. But worse than a disaster, she allowed the creation of death squads and they began operating in Argentina. So the military, these death squads were actually organized by the military, but they were separate from the military operations, and they were killing people in pretty good numbers in 1974 and 1975. Now Peron, while he was in that brief period when he was in power, he was very concerned. He's a populist. Populism doesn't really have an ideology. He was neither left-wing nor right-wing. But under him, people filled in the blanks, and you had very serious leftist movements who admired and followed Peron, and you had very serious right-wing movements who followed Peron. When Peron himself was very concerned about what he called the Marxist subversion. He was very concerned about Cuba spreading into Latin America. So his instincts were definitely right of center, and he encouraged the beginnings of this cooperation with the other countries to track down the radical leftists who had themselves created an alliance of four groups: the leftist movements from Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, and Bolivia. In Bolivia, the left-wing movement was actually started by Che Guevara in the late 1960s and continued after Che Guevara's death. So there were serious left-wing movements going on, and Peron was very concerned about that. And so he encouraged this international cooperation even before Operation Condor was formalized. And then he dies and is succeeded by his incompetent widow, who bumbles through the rest of 1975, and in early 1976, the military kind of puts her out of her misery and overthrows her, takes over power, even though they had effectively been in charge of repression for months at that point. And at that point, when the military takes over, Isabel, but I don't mean that she was killed, she was just thrown into exile. The military takes over, and Operation Condor goes into full swing, particularly in Argentina, because that's where all of the left-wingers had gathered.
Well, and we've talked about the Peron family previously on the show, so I'll have the link to that episode on the show notes page. But before we wrap up, let's talk about the aftermath of this a little more. What efforts at justice have there been in the aftermath of Operation Condor? What sorts of investigations have there been? What sorts of efforts at accountability have there been related to Operation Condor?
So that's a really important question. The governments all returned to civilian government by the end of the 1980s, with the exception of Chile, which the other governments had become democratic or at least civilian by the mid-1980s, but Chile was still a dictatorship under Pinochet until 1990. And there was a transition, an election. It was a peaceful transfer of power. And at that point, judicial investigations were started to account for the thousands and thousands of people who had been killed during the dictatorships. Argentina was very important. In 1985, they began the investigations against the generals. There was then an amnesty that stopped the investigations for a while. Chile in the 1990s, under the new democratic government, launched an investigation of the Letelier assassination in Washington, and actually convicted 3 members of the secret police called DINA, and they were in prison. That was really the only human rights case that was investigated in Chile. At the end of the 90s, 1998 specifically, Pinochet, he had given up power as president. He was no longer president, but he continued as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. And so until 1998. When he stepped down in 1998, that opened the door to more serious human rights investigations. And in fact, Spain launched an investigation. I was somewhat involved in that because I had meetings in Washington about getting U.S. documents that would support the investigation of Pinochet. A Spanish judge opened this investigation about the repression, but specifically oriented toward the crimes of Operation Condor, because Operation Condor, being international, left tracks that were in other countries and could be gathered, could be obtained. The evidence could be obtained by the investigators, even though in the country itself there was no access to this evidence. So it's kind of subverted the military's own cover-up. So Operation Condor made the military very vulnerable because of its international aspects. And the judge indicted Pinochet and sent an order for Pinochet's interrogation and then eventually arrest and extradition to the United Kingdom, to London, to Scotland Yard. And Pinochet was there for meetings. He had meetings with Margaret Thatcher, the prime minister, and he was there making some arms deals to make some money for himself. And he was also having a back operation in a London clinic. And so because this order arrives from Spain, and Pinochet is arrested in this clinic and is held in London for 13 months and eventually returned to Chile because of old age and Chile's promise that they would try him in Chile. So he returns to Chile. He is submitted to charges, which go on and on. He eventually dies before he is ever jailed. But from that point on, his political power is nullified. He's under investigation, and the Chilean judicial system, judges, launch a whole series of investigations of human rights crimes from the 1970s. And one of them is specifically named Operation Condor. So Operation Condor was critical to the arrest of Pinochet in London, and then later in Chile, it is the subject of an investigation that lasts from 1998 to 2016, I believe, when a verdict is a sentence, they call it a sentencia, is issued, resulting in the conviction of 12 officials, 12 officers, Chilean officers. And many of these officers have been in prison for since the beginning of the 2000s. And are still in prisons. I'm not sure how many are still there now. They're quite old, and some of them they're starting to die off. But there's at least 250 convictions in Chile of officers for human rights crimes. In Argentina, the number is equivalent. They've been even more energetic in the investigations in the 2000s. And again, in Argentina, they also have a case that is called Operation Condor, and it's investigating the international operations as they were functioning inside Argentina. So the human rights investigations have gathered steam. You could argue was quite late, but in the 2000s, there have been hundreds of cases prosecuted.
All right. Well, John, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. In the introduction, I mentioned that you have written Death in the Revolution and that you've also written The Condor Years. Can you take a moment to talk about those in a little more detail, as well as any other resources, readings, or books that you would recommend people take a look at?
Well, certainly like to talk about Death in the Revolution, because that's my latest book, and I'm in the process of getting it published in English. It's already been published in Spanish, which you can see here. It's a great photo. This is the American, Frank Tarugi, and the other two men are Brazilian, and then the girl, who was 16 at the time, was the girlfriend of one of those guys. That picture was taken in 1972. Two Americans, Frank Tarugi and Charles Horman, were killed in the first 2 weeks after the coup, and their case was became very famous in the United States because it was Americans who were killed as part of the coup. They were leftist, they were activists, and the United States government, which supported the coup with great enthusiasm, was put in a difficult position because the military government that the United States was supporting had actually murdered two Americans. And the United States government responded to that by covering up what had happened, and refusing to say what they knew, which was that the Chilean military had actually executed these two Americans, and they hid information from the family members. One of them, Horman, was missing for a month. His body was actually in the morgue, but the Chilean officials had prevented his body from being identified, so the United States could say that we don't know where he is, nobody knows what happens. Both of them were eventually found and identified, and their cases were investigated both by Chilean officials and by U.S. officials, resulting in the truth, except that the truth was hidden from becoming public. My book, for the first time, shows what those investigations showed and how they were actually killed and for what reason, what kind of political activities they were involved in. The case became very famous because of a movie that was released in 1982 by Costa Gavras called Missing. And that movie won a Pulitzer Prize for an Oscar. They won an Oscar for an adapted screenplay. It was based on a book on the case. And many of the conclusions of the movie are wrong. They were based on information that at the time seemed logical, but my investigation shows that they were wrong. The movie portrays them as pacifists, and that somehow they were killed because they knew too much about the military coup and the U.S. involvement in it. That scenario is not supported by the evidence. They were actually killed because of their political activism, from the evidence that I've been able to gather. They were heroes of the resistance. They came down there to participate in the revolution of Allende. They supported the Allende revolution because it was not only a revolution, but because it was democratic. They were good American Democrats, leftists, of course, but they were good Democrats. I don't mean Democratic Party. I mean they believed in democracy, as we all do, and they made a commitment to the revolution. They did things that, like many other people did, that made them a target, and many of those people involved in those kind of political activities were arrested, and in their case, they were not only arrested, but they were executed. And so this story of these two young people and their idealism and their participation in the revolution is told really for the first time in the true version in my book, which I hope is going to get published in the next few months but I'm still looking for a publisher. So if any of anybody listening to this has any leads, I'd be happy to know about it.
All right. Yeah, obviously we're hoping for the best with finding an English language publisher and getting that published as soon as is reasonably possible. There are obviously a lot of different layers and aspects to Operation Condor. Is there anything that we haven't touched on today so far that you think is extremely critical that the listeners understand before we conclude this conversation?
Well, there's one part of the Operation Condor story that relates to the Letelier assassination in Washington. And that's, for the United States, that's the most important case, that Chile launched a car bomb terrorist attack that killed a very important leader of the Chilean resistance. There was an attempt that I argue could have, by the United States government, to bring Operation Condor under control and keep it from expanding outside of Latin America. The United States in 1976, didn't have any problem with killing people in Latin America, but when they expanded beyond Latin America and the CIA discovered that and told Kissinger about it, told his people about it, they made an attempt to bring it under control, to tell the governments that the United States had a big problem with assassinating people in Europe, and that they should stop that. So Kissinger approved what they called a démarche, a warning to the governments that was to be delivered by the ambassador in each country, saying, we know about Operation Condor. If you carry out any of these operations, we will have a big problem with that. In other words, we oppose it. Unfortunately, and this was right before the Letelier assassination, which they didn't know about, but they knew about the plans in Europe. Unfortunately, Kissinger canceled the order. It hadn't been executed in a month since he had given the order for various reasons. And then because he was told that Operation Condor that these international assassination missions had been canceled because of the opposition of the Brazilians, Kissinger says, "Oh well, if they're not happening, let's just cancel the order." And so he says, "Take no further action." That was September 16th, and Orlando Letelier is killed on September 21st. That story is very important for U.S. readers to understand.
All right. Well, John, I want to thank you so much for joining me today and being so generous with your time. Again, the books that we mentioned in the introduction, The Condor Years, How Pinochet and His Allies Brought Terrorism to Three Continents, and Death and the Revolution is the one that John has talked about a little more extensively here today. Of course, his website's johndingus.com and thecondoryears.com as well. All of that information will be linked from the show notes page for today's episode, placesandprofiles.com/14. So that's the place to go for resources and links related to today's topic and conversation, placesandprofiles.com/14. John, thank you again so much for being so generous with your time and for joining me today to take a look at Operation Condor. I greatly appreciate it.
Okay, it's been a pleasure, and thanks for the opportunity to tell all these stories that occurred in the past, but they continue to be important and for people to understand if we're going to keep our democracy here.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Places and Profiles podcast. Please visit placesandprofiles.com to subscribe and listen to more episodes. Come back again soon, and thanks for listening.